It's my pleasure to introduce Ignacio Montoya from University of Nevada, Reno. And he'll be talking about leveraging colonial privilege to support the establishment, development, and teaching of Numu language Northern Paiute classes at the university level. Welcome, Ignacio, once more to SAIL, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Wilson, for the welcome, and thank you all for being here this afternoon. I'm going to start by situating both me and this work. So I'm coming to you virtually today from the ancestral and contemporary lands of the Numu and the Washu people, where I am privileged to live and work. That territory where I live and work is indicated on the map where the red arrows are pointing. And I'm affiliated with the University of Nevada, Reno, as Wilson said, which was built on and occupies unceded land of the Numu, Washu, and Nua peoples. And with regard to my own positionality in this work, I'm a Latinx, non-Indigenous scholar. I was trained in linguistics and came to Reno in 2017 as an assistant professor at the University of Nevada, Reno. And what I'll be talking to you about today is Numa classes that are offered through UNR. So the purpose of this research more generally and of this presentation specifically is to explore how the construct of privilege applies to the context of colonialism. And this is what I'm going to be referring to as colonial privilege. So after introducing the notion of colonial privilege, I will then use that construct as a lens for exploring my own experiences with establishing, developing, and helping with the teaching of the Numa classes at UNR. I do this in order to illustrate some of the ways in which colonial privilege manifests itself generally, with a particular focus on how it manifests in the academic context. And finally, I'll synthesize the insights that come from such an exploration in order to develop some strategies for leveraging colonial privilege in colonial institutions, such as universities, in order to support larger efforts at decolonizing these institutions and their relationships to Indigenous people. In discussing privilege, I'm drawing from scholars such as Peggy McIntosh, whose scholarship has been foundational in our understanding of privilege. And based in part on her work, I'm defining privilege as invisible and unearned advantages that arise from being a member of a particular social group. And one of the key ideas in this definition is that privilege is generally invisible. We are much more likely to be aware of how one group of people are oppressed than we are to see the flip side, which is that another group of people are advantaged. These advantages can take many forms. McIntosh refers to these as special provisions, tools, maps, guides, code books, passports, visas, clothes, compass, emergency gear, and blank checks. Now, this concept of privilege has been applied primarily, I would say, to race and gender. So many of us are familiar with the terms white privilege and male privilege. But in the literature on privilege, we also find references to several other social and identity groups, such as those involving sexual orientation, social class, and religion. In what I've read so far, though, I have yet to see significant references to indigeneity or the colonial context. As I mentioned earlier, privilege is a flip side of oppression. And in discussions of social inequality, power imbalance, and oppression, the discussions tend to focus on the experiences of the disadvantaged. This can be seen, for example, when we consider how something such as wage inequality connected to gender, how that is framed. So we hear things like, for every dollar that a man makes, a woman on average makes only 78 cents. And what this framing does is it sets the by women. Now, this is an important thing to focus on. Those deficits are real, but it contributes to the invisibility of privilege. Yes, wage inequality is connected to female disadvantages, but it's also connected to male advantage. So what the construct of privilege does is to highlight those advantages, which can be seen in the reframing of the wage inequality statistic as, for every dollar that a woman makes, a man makes on average $1.28. And it's important to note that privilege, just like other social and identity characteristics, is intersectional, complex, and exists on a spectrum. As Kimmel writes, just as all forms of inequality are not the same, all forms of privilege are not the same. So the claim that I'm making is that given that privilege is an integral part of understanding oppression and social inequality, and given that colonization is a source of past and present oppression and inequalities, an individual's relationship to colonialism also carries with it unearned advantages and disadvantages. Therefore, the construct of privilege can certainly be useful in understanding the effects of colonialism. I'm therefore defining colonial privilege as the invisible and unearned advantages that arise from one's participation in an association with colonial heritage and colonial structures. Like other forms of privilege, it is intersectional, complex, and exists along a spectrum. And one of the ultimate goals that I have in applying the construct of privilege to the context of colonialism is to make colonial privilege visible, which I think is critical for redressing the kinds of present inequalities that we see arising from past and present colonialism. So I'm next going to apply the construct of colonial privilege to my experiences with the Numu classes at UNR. But first I'll start with a brief overview of the language and then go on to introduce some basics of the Numu classes. So Numu Yadwana, also known as Northern Paiute, is an indigenous language of the Northwestern Great Basin, spoken in what is now Nevada, California, Idaho, and Oregon. And as of 2007, there were estimated to be 700 speakers of varying degrees of fluency. In terms of relationships to other languages, Numu is a part of the Numic branch of the Uruasecan language family. So these classes, the UNR classes the Paiute classes at UNR came about as a result of an idea raised by Christina Thomas, a tribal member from the local community who at the time was also a UNR student. In early 2018, she approached me and another faculty member, Janan Ferguson, about finding a way to allow students to take Numu language classes to fulfill the university's language requirement. We then brought a proposal to the World Languages and Literatures Department for establishing these classes, and by spring of 2019, the proposal had been accepted, and we then hired the instructor, and the first class launched in fall of 2019. Numu classes consist of a 4-course series, and after this coming semester, at the end of spring 2021, we will have offered one full rotation of all 4 courses and a half of another rotation. Also, as a result of the pandemic, from the middle of spring 2020 onward, the classes have been conducted on Zoom. About half of the students who have taken these classes have been Native American, mostly but not exclusively from the Numu community. A little over a quarter have been white and a little under a quarter Latinx. The instructor is Ralph Burns, an elder from the Pyramid Lake Paiute tribe who is a native speaker of the language and also a renowned storyteller. As for my involvement in the classes, my role can probably be best characterized as an administrative and instructional support role. Among the tasks I've participated in include the submission of the initial proposal, curriculum and syllabus development, and certain administrative tasks. I've been present at all the classes where I provide instructional supplements. So for example, if the instructor asks me to explain something from the perspective of a linguist, I also provide technological support for the classes. My relationship to Ralph and the local community had already been in place for a few years before these classes started. And so I came to this enterprise already invested in and connected to the people, the culture, and the language. In a paper I'm working on with 2 other participants in the class, we argue that these classes serve as a site of decolonization. So to begin with, we argue that the very existence of these classes is in and of itself a decolonial act. This is because in varied ways, the classes disrupt ideas and institutions of colonialism. For one, the fact that Numu classes exist in the course catalog alongside languages such as Spanish and French signals that Indigenous languages have just as much legitimacy as other languages. In addition, the existence of these classes serves to raise awareness among the broader community of the existence of the language and the people. And also the fact that a Numu elder is the instructor and has autonomy with regard to how the class is taught. This is a way of recognizing Indigenous expertise. In addition, these classes serve as a space for Indigenous students, especially Numu students, to see their culture represented on campus. So some of the features of these classes that make them a decolonial space are that they incorporate abundant storytelling, they create a connection to communal life, and they are embedded in an informal and relaxed atmosphere that incorporates humor, relationality, and a shared sense of commitment to the culture. Through my involvement in the establishment, development, and teaching of the classes, various types of colonial privilege emerged. These are what I'm referring to as the privilege of authority, the privilege of access, the privilege of connections, the privilege of knowledge, and the privilege of optional detachment. And I'll discuss each of them, and I'm modeling my presentation on the list of white privileges that McIntosh develops in her 1988 paper. The privilege of authority refers to the fact that when I speak about the language and education, I am seen as a credible authority. At no point in this process, whether I was talking about language, education, university structures, or really anything else, were my qualifications questioned. And this is true regardless of whether or not I actually had expertise to speak on a particular matter. So for example, my PhD in linguistics certainly gives me some authority to speak about language structure more generally, but I didn't receive any training on assessment in college level language classes, let alone assessment in college level Indigenous language classes. In other words, not only were my actual qualifications accepted without question, but additional expertise was also assumed. Now, this stands in contrast to the experience of the elder who taught the classes. So one of the challenges we had was in the hiring process, where he didn't have the expected formal credentials, i.e. a higher education degree, even though those credentials weren't what actually qualified him to teach the class. He did possess the relevant knowledge and skills. He had, in fact, been teaching the language for several years in a variety of contexts, but that knowledge and those skills did not fit into the pre-established standards of the colonial institution. The privilege of access refers to the fact that as a member of a colonial institution, I have ready access to critical structures. These structures include, for example, the curriculum proposal system, syllabus guidelines, templates, and expectations, HR structures, the course learning management system for the class, and venues for expressing my ideas, which in this case was important because we needed to advertise the Numu classes so that we could get more students enrolled. So as a result of the access that I had, one thing that was essential for the success of the program was me leveraging that access by acting as an intermediary. This helped make the instructor's job easier because I was able to take care of the kinds of administrative tasks that were not relevant for his teaching and which would have taken him quite a bit longer to figure out on his own. In addition, I was able to leverage this privilege of ready access to guide him in learning the structures that did actually facilitate his work. So he has learned a lot of the technology in the process, but it helped that I already had access to that ahead of time. Privilege of connections refers to the fact that as a member of a colonial institution, I have connections to individuals with the power to help or to hurt. So this means, for one, that I'm aware of who are the allies, the power brokers, and the critics. And in addition, my connections to these individuals also allow me to know their motivations. So for instance, I can know if someone is critical because they fundamentally disagree with the project or simply because they don't know enough of what it involves. And I can therefore leverage that to be able to be an ally. In addition, it's worth noting that as a member of the colonial institution, I'm also a part of that ecosystem, which means that I can benefit from this network of mutual support, obligation, and accountability. This was not the case with Indigenous stakeholders. So Indigenous stakeholders not affiliated with a university needed to first establish a connection with someone inside to even be recognized as a partner in this project. And this is despite the fact that there were plenty of people who are not affiliated with a university who have helped with these classes. Privilege of knowledge refers to the fact that I possess knowledge that is necessary for success in the institution and that is often assumed to be common knowledge. So this is what McIntosh refers to as the code books, maps, and compass that are part of the invisible knapsack of privilege. In the context of the UNR Numu classes, my privilege manifested itself in the fact that I had knowledge about stated and unstated values of the institution, knowledge about the rhetoric favored by the university, knowledge of stated and unstated expectations, and knowledge of institutional culture, history, and politics. The privilege of knowledge I possess also has been useful in understanding what the real expectations of the university are. So for example, I know what aspects of a conventional syllabus are critical for us to keep in some form or another, and what aspects are really only there as a matter of course. So I'll note that the privilege of knowledge also means that the knowledge that I possess is judged as higher in the university hierarchy than the knowledge that, for instance, the elder possesses, even though, of course, his knowledge is far more valuable than mine in the context of these courses. Finally, the last privilege that I'll speak about today is what I'm calling the privilege of optional detachment. And this refers to the fact that as someone not of the Indigenous community, I can step away from the work without a cost to my traditional language, culture, and community. Though I certainly care about the language, it isn't my ancestral language that's being threatened. It's not my traditional culture that we're trying to strengthen. And this allows me to take more risks and to have fewer anxieties about the work. This privilege of optional detachment also acts as a safety net. It protects me from a certain degree of emotional or spiritual trauma if something doesn't go well with the classes. For Indigenous stakeholders who do not have the privilege of optional detachment, the cost of walking away or of this endeavor not working out is both personal and communal. It's not just the individual that suffers, but their broader community does as well. So now I'll go back to the point that I made earlier, that an important reason for exploring colonial privilege in the first place is because it can help us redress the kinds of present inequalities that we see arising from past and present colonialism. One of the ways in which institutions such as universities can engage with decolonization is to foster the creation of decolonial spaces within the colonial context. This is what I think has been achieved by the Numu classes at UNR. This was accomplished in large part because the Indigenous instructor was free to design and teach his classes however he saw fit. So what was my role as a non-Indigenous ally with colonial privilege? Well, I believe my role was to leverage my colonial privilege in order to allow Indigenous people to make the space their own. This leveraging of colonial privilege did involve some positive actions on my part, but it's also important to note that leveraging the privilege has sometimes actually required giving it up for the sake of Indigenous self-determination. In order to begin to reduce the power imbalance inherent to the colonial context, this involves reducing the colonial privilege. In fact, as a general principle, the default should be Indigenous autonomy. In other words, Indigenous stakeholders set and manage the agenda. And if they decide there is to be no non-Indigenous involvement, then that choice is to be respected. In practice, of course, if we're talking about academia, then what we're most likely looking at is a situation of collaboration where colonial privilege is going to play a role. Here too, the default should be Indigenous autonomy, but in a collaborative context, the question arises, when is colonial privilege used rather than given up? For one, colonial privilege is used when the Indigenous stakeholders invite it. Also, since a goal of decolonization is Indigenous self-determination, another time when colonial privilege should be used is when doing so makes Indigenous self-determination possible. So for instance, these classes would likely not have been possible in the first place without the leveraging of colonial privilege, since there were so many initial structural barriers to their establishment. Another principle to keep in mind when using colonial privilege is to ensure that doing so is complementary to Indigenous self-determination. So for instance, the Numu classes, when we transitioned to remote instructions, we began implementing online quizzes. And these quizzes were created entirely by the instructor, but it was then up to me and a couple of other individuals with UNR affiliation to set them up as online quizzes. Thus, our two expertises, Indigenous knowledge of the elder and technical knowledge of the non-Indigenous allies, complemented each other well. Now, the main idea behind all of these principles is that because there are inherent power imbalances in relationships between universities and indigenous communities that result in colonial privilege for those associated with a university, elevation of indigenous epistemologies and methodologies requires making them primary in order to shift the balance in the direction of indigenous needs, interests, and priorities. To conclude, so to conclude, this work shows that the construct of privilege is generally applicable to a variety of contexts of past and present power imbalances, which includes contexts associated with colonialism. I argue that, in fact, it is quite productive to use the construct of privilege as a lens for examining colonial and indigenous relationships. Doing so is fruitful for theories of privilege, since it advances our understanding of how privilege functions in different contexts. It's fruitful for theories of decolonization, since it provides a framework for how non-indigenous people can contribute to decolonial work. And more practically, being aware of colonial privilege can enhance interactions between colonial and indigenous communities. Finally, I argue that the construct of colonial privilege is not only useful for better understanding larger social structures, we as individuals can also apply this construct to concrete, specific, and personal experiences. And in this way, it can be a tool, particularly for non-Indigenous allies, for self-reflection and a guide for enacting decolonial practices. So that's it for the talk. Thank you very much. And I very much look forward to comments, questions, or suggestions. This is a work in progress, so any feedback you have would certainly be very much appreciated. Thank you, Bishama.
Thank you, Ignacio. Great talk. So yeah, if anyone has questions, please raise your hand and go ahead. Shayla, I see you have a question on the. Oh, she has a private questions from you. Anyone had?
I have a question. How do you balance taking the the Western-based frameworks from which linguistics is generally taught, and the processes of syntax and semantics as taught in academia, and reconciling those with Indigenous knowledge and the ways in which that might conflict with more Westernized styles of linguistic research?
Yeah, that's a great question. And actually, so the answer to that, I would say, is that considering the context. So in this context, I very, very much put the Western ideas of linguistics to the side. Those actually don't ever come up in my discussions with the elder unless, and this happens sometimes, unless he specifically asks for it. So I think that's one of the ways in which I've managed to do it in this particular context, to say, like the Western ideas of linguistics completely take a back seat unless this is something that has been specifically asked for by the speaker. Now, your question does sort of relate to how do we in linguistics connect to Indigenous? That's a larger, bigger question that I think is definitely very much worth asking. But I do think this idea of having the default being that the Indigenous knowledge lead, I think this is a way to start doing that. And, in this particular context that I'm in, it's relatively easy because these are classes that are for the elder, for the people in the community. So it's much, much easier to take a back seat when it comes to this sort of Western knowledge. And I am working on this question of like, what does it mean in these larger contexts? So for example, in academic publications. And there I still do believe that we need to have some kind of sort of reduction of the power that Western linguistic ideas have, certainly for linguists, but I think for people generally. This is what I was talking about with the privilege of authority, is I don't actually have to say very much about the language. No one actually checks my credentials even about this language. They just assume that, well, you're a Western academic linguist, you must have this knowledge. So I do think that even in these academic papers that really are focused on linguistic description, we really do need to sort of try to find ways to let the Western knowledge take a back seat. But yeah, excellent question.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Liz, I see a comment. Do you want to share here? Everyone.
Oh, sure. I was just caught by that phrase, the detachment that you have that's made possible by the fact that you are an outsider to the community and don't have as much emotional investment, right, or emotional risk in being able, so that you are able to detach from the work. And so I was thinking about how that might connect with what Ruth was talking about in terms of the, if we think about it from the other perspective of emotional risk and attachment. And I was just wondering if you could comment on that.
Sure. Yeah. And I think that's an excellent observation. And in fact, I mean, the idea behind privilege is that so much of this is invisible. So in fact, I probably wouldn't even have thought of that as being a privilege if not for hearing people from communities talk about the connection that they have. And I like to think that I have a connection to the language either, but when you hear people like Ruth talk about this, you realize it isn't the same. And I think that's an important thing for us to recognize, that that there's just so much more at stake emotionally and spiritually for people from the community, that in some ways, while it is a privilege for those of us from the outside, that is something that we should not be taking for granted. Because yes, if you listen to people that are working in their communities with their languages, there's this strong emotional attachment that actually that means that they have less freedom, I think, than someone that's coming in from the outside.
Any other questions?
Could I ask about the students?
Sure.
So what we found in the early days of Indigenous studies was that the Indigenous students were really struggling with the language classes, and the non-Indigenous students were doing really well. But a lot of that had to do with the barriers that the Indigenous students brought with them. Rochelle, if I say something that's not right, please correct me. So I think that at least for some of the instructors, they really worked hard with the students to try to find ways of overcoming. So that's another kind of privilege. And so they worked really hard with the students, particularly the Indigenous students, but also the non-Indigenous students, to get everybody to be on the same page, more or less, about it, so that the Indigenous students could thrive and that the non-Indigenous students wouldn't see the Indigenous students as somehow deficient. And so I think that that's another, it's related to what you were talking about, but it's a different issue. And I wonder if you have any thoughts about that, or if you've observed any of that.
Yeah, I think that's I mean, it's these sort of ideas also apply, I think, to the students. That I do think that a lot of, I mean, a few things that I've sort of seen is with non-Indigenous students that are taking the class. First of all, again, they have the option of sort of detaching in a way that, you know, that other people do, as other non-Indigenous people do as well. And I think another thing that sort of, it's an interesting phenomenon is there's a sense of obligation, I think, that a lot of the Indigenous students have, which makes it, you know, it keeps them going, actually. So in some ways, like they are persistent, so they don't detach, they continue to persist. But I also think that it's an interesting, another advantage is that what I've seen is non-Indigenous students who are doing well in the classes are very strongly praised. Wow, look at this. This is fantastic. And again, this is another kind of privilege where I think for Indigenous students, it's sort of expected that they, of course, you're going to do well. This is your language. You should do well. There's a sense of obligation. Whereas with the non-Indigenous students, just the fact that they were there was something that was sort of praised in some way. And I think that's another kind of privilege is, you know, their motivations must be pure. They're coming in and look at how well they're doing. Which yeah, is another form of privilege, I think, that we see in these contexts.
Thanks.
We have time to another question. Anyone? Maria Pasqua, do you wanna?
So I mean, I'm looking at the question in the chat. recommendations. Well, I think when the recommendation that I would have is, and I'm not sure what context, what the context is there, but I think one of the things that that is really sort of critical for these classes is that it really be led by Indigenous people. So, I really do try to do just the administrative things, and really, the instructor can teach however he wants to, and I'm available if he has questions. But I think it's clear to everyone that he is the instructor, and it's clear to everyone that he can teach how he'd like. And I think that that to me is kind of a critical part of making these classes decolonial spaces, is to give this self-determination to the instructors themselves. I guess that's a big recommendation I would have.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Ignacio.